I thought we'd just take a quick look at the charter. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to look at this ahead of time in their process of deciding whether or not to join the group. The part I really just want to focus on is the deliverables that we're looking at. And so the primary goal we have is to create some documentation around the common types of change that we would expect with authoritative data. And then to look beyond that and create some specifications of like, how would you record these change? How do you express them? How can they be conveyed to downstream users? And then we'll also try and move on to look at some tooling and make some recommendations about either tools that exist or how tools could be created to facilitate that process of creating those documents, and also how do downstream users consume the changes. So that's the basic goal. We will be a little flexible in that we do want to, kind of follow where the working group wants to go. But to sort of kick things off, I do wonder if I could make a request if someone is willing to go through this attendees list and move anyone who wasn't able to make it down to the absent section. That just helps us to sort of keep track of who's participating and who's not. And as I take other notes, it's a little easier for me if someone can volunteer to take care of that.
I can do that if you can share the link to me. I can.
Sure. So yeah, the link to the notes are always in the meeting that goes out through Outlook, but I will copy it as well here.
Yeah, if it's in Outlook, I can get it. Thank you. Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah. And you'll just see that there's a navigation tabs at the top of all the pages. So the original charter's there. The other stuff that we primarily work on will be like working documents and meeting notes. Deliverables won't come to the very end. So once you get on any of these pages, you can pretty quickly navigate to any of the other pages. So just to sort of look at what we're going to talk about today, we've already done our introductions. We're going to do some brainstorming around use cases. If we get through that in today's meeting, then we'll go ahead and jump into starting to define types of changes. But so with that in mind, I ahead of time created a working document to start the process of gathering use cases. And I put in 2 use cases that I have, and then I want to make sure that we capture any use cases that other folks have. So the 2 use cases I work with regularly, and I primarily work with the first one, is we cache the full set of authoritative data. And we have that cache locally. And anytime we want to access authoritative data, we're doing it through the cache and not through the original source. So our options for update, and what we do currently is the first option, because that's really the only option we have, which is to take the entire set of authoritative data down again and then just have it available. Of course, that does not address the need to actually update anything that might to identify like what things have changed and take any actions that we might need to take based on those changes. So a more ideal approach to this would be incremental downloads, and then we just update the pieces of the cache that have changed. And that gives us a couple of advantages. One is that it takes a lot of time to bring down the entire set and index it to make it available. The other is that it really allows us to know exactly what changed and take any actions that might need to happen. So before I move on to the second one, I wonder, are there anyone else who wants to comment about this particular use case or expand on types of options or add any other details we might want to capture about that use case? Okay, I'm going to take silence as no other comments about that one. The second use case that I have been involved with is caching of labels in an application. So in this case, you've gone out, someone has selected a piece of authoritative data that they want to make a relationship with. And when they take that URI, they also cache the label at the same time. And so for this period, there are, if the label changes, I may want to change the label that's cached. In some cases, I've heard people say they don't want to change that. They want to keep whatever was happened at that moment in time. But it would be nice to at least create a report or something that says, hey, these things have changed, and then have a human who can review them. So the options for update are periodic query of authoritative data to determine. So like I know what labels I have, and I can just kind of reach out and check and see, has that label changed, and then make whatever change I need to make. Of course, that's very costly, right? Because then I have to look at every label in my entire application that I've cached, and it can take time to identify those and realize what they are. And the more ideal would be to be able to watch an incremental feed and be able to react to the changes that happen. And I can say, oh, 3 things have changed this week. I'm going to go and look for those 3 things. And again, I can either just automatically update them, or I can, send a report out that says, hey, these 3 things have changed to the appropriate people. They might want to look at that and see what they think about that change. So any thoughts on that particular use case?
So I have a question. What if the change is not, how do I want to put this? So what if there's a change, but whatever was old, whatever was prior is not mapped to that change? Does that make sense?
So let me just ask a question about that. Is this the case where like something split or something merged, and so it's not like just an updated label, it's some other kind of change?
No. So the example that I'll give you is that when mesh changes, whatever it was prior is just gone. They don't say, okay, this is going to change to this, and they don't keep whatever the old thing was. It's just, it's gone, and whatever is new is new. Does that make sense?
So it's more of like a deprecation of one and adding another.
Yeah, that's kind of what happens. Even if they're similar and even if they're related, the old one is just gone. Not what I would prefer to happen, but it is what happens.
But Nancy, in that case, the identifier stays the same?
No. So what's really unfortunate is that in mesh, sometimes, at least in the past, they would reuse identifiers. They would list, it's awful.
Yes, I know. That's
yeah, I'm really sorry.
So that's not the practice anymore, but there are still identifiers that in mesh that used to represent something else.
Yeah, and it may be, and to be all in full honesty, I would have to go back and talk to the people who create mesh to find out if they're still reusing identifiers.
Yeah, I don't think they are. I mean, because I don't. The problem with mesh is sometimes older headings end up as cross references, and sometimes they don't.
Right.
And generally, if you have an older heading, sometimes what will happen is there'll be a little explanatory thing, and they'll say, you have to search this term for this period of stuff. So, and then you have to search this term for this period of stuff. So yeah, it's kind of, it's not very regular.
Yeah, so I guess what I was, you may have some use cases that are just some things that are not kept the way we might normally expect them to. So I guess what I was trying to get at was what do we do with outliers?
Yeah, I think it's good to definitely keep that on the list. Go ahead.
Lynette, I like to ask a question about the scope of the work of this group. The use case that you just described, the caching of a label in an application, that sounds like what is happening when you're using Sinopia to catalog. But that's what we are starting to do. But my interest is broader than that, and that's because we are starting to put a lot of URIs in our MARC records. So we not only caching a label and a URI in BibFrame records, we're doing it in MARC records as well. And for those, we also would want to, keep them up to date and stay in sync. But in that situation, very, very often what we're also doing is we also get the entire authority record. So we're not just having the label and the URI, which are in the bib record, but we also get a copy of the authority records, which we put into our local system. So we're caching the authority record as well. And so that also would have to be kept in sync. And I'm just wondering whether you're including or we are including that kind of scenarios in the scope of the work of this group.
I certainly do see that could be part of the scope. And I think that that's why I want to capture these use cases, because I know what I've been working with and where my challenges are. I think what you just described is actually just a minor change on what was already being described. So that has implications for how much data comes back. If we do incremental updates, if you only need the URI and the label, that's one thing. But if you need the entire record, then you need to have more information that comes back in that feed. So I think it's really important to define those kind of use cases so that we know, as we're working through some of the technical details of how we want to do things, what do we want to get back? So I'm glad you brought that up. Are there other use cases or comments on one of the existing ones?
I don't know if this is tied in with the cache of labels or if this would be a new use case, but new entities. So new labels, new URIs, and being able to handle those.
So in that case, is that like locally generated?
It could be, or if we're trying to keep ours in sync with another database out there to know what's new, not only what's changed, but what's new.
Ah, yes, I see.
Yeah, because we try to keep our local authority database current with, and then that trickles down to other systems. We've got other, like our archival system and our digital asset management system. Those have authority information that needs to be synced. So being able to know those new entities, and that's a use case for us. And maybe it's related, but also deletions, right? Entities that have been deleted from merging or from cancellations of some kind.
Yeah, I definitely think we'll probably get more details on that when we start talking
Yes.
about types of change, because that is definitely on my radar for like types of change, things that are new, things that are deleted, things that are changed. And I also mentioned earlier when we were talking about Nancy's use case of, there's also the question about things that are split or merged. So I think I'd like to capture more use cases first, just to be sure we've got those covered, and then we can jump right into those types
Perfect.
of changes. Are there other use cases that folks have?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that we've been thinking about is how we're using, let's say in Sinopia, for instance, there's a couple different stages here of where the data is coming, where it's being stored and then being used as a cache to go into a new sort of path. And I'm thinking about the cache of data within Sinopia, and some of those sort of authority vocabularies are caches and some are direct queries. And then there's this issue of, because we're also now playing around with conversion, and we're really exploring what we want out of in the conversion or BF to mark or RDF to mark conversion affinity group. We're also looking at, so once things go to mark, we don't have a really good workflow for how to update those things that have been converted to like a so-called a classic mark record. And if things have changed in that process. So I think there's a couple stages of data sync functionality, and in terms of if a vocabulary is being used as a cache query as opposed to a direct query, how often that data is being updated, and then once it gets converted, if it's being converted. Because if one of the things I think we really want in our UChicago folio environment, eventually, it's not going to happen now, not this year, and that is data store in triples as opposed to data store in mark. And I think that that's something that is because then you need a mapping to the instance. And so I think I don't even have a clear workflow yet in my mind for how to update the triples per se once the data is actually being stored. So I think there's a few stages in there which I think I need to sort of clarify, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about right now. Is that a use case or two use cases? I'm not sure.
So what I mostly heard, because I heard a couple of things on what you were saying, and I tried to capture those, and you can certainly feel free to go back and edit these notes and clarify what it is that you meant by it. Kind of the piece that I was hearing was workflow oriented. It's like, when do I do what as I'm moving back and forth between bib frame and mark, and if we're moving towards putting everything in triples, what would that workflow look like? So it kind of felt to me like it was focused on the workflow of when you do what action and when do things apply.
Yeah, I think that's probably the clearest way of saying it. It's really important because everything happens in time. So trying to figure out how to work in time and organize like data integrity in time, data consistency in time. So I think the workflow is probably a good word to use. Thank you.
Any other use cases folks want to add? So one thing I'm curious about, because I started to say this when someone else was talking and was asking if this is what they were talking about. And this is around local, like when you create things locally. Does anyone have a use case around creating their own authoritative records locally? I know I've heard people talk about that, like when they're waiting for something to become part of a vocabulary, they have some local stuff they need to keep in the meantime. I don't know that we would necessarily tackle that in this group, but I do just want to know like if that's a use case for folks.
We used to do that historically, but we're trying to get away from that, trying to take things upstream down.
Excellent.
Yeah, sometimes here we will make authority records for like donors or strictly kind of local local people. Again, like, I think like Greg said, we're trying to more or less get away from that. We do have NACO catalogers now, so a lot of times we'll just go ahead and establish it nationally, just rather than have to do it twice if necessary. But yeah, I mean, we do occasionally do that, and also for collections and stuff.
So I can jump in here. This is the reason why I'm in this group, because I manage a database that collects a lot of information about people involved in the production and trade of medieval manuscripts. And so we, like by necessity, have to create our own authority records for most of these people and institutions. And I'm also directing a project that will be attempting to make a national union catalog of manuscripts in US collections, of pre-modern manuscripts in US collections. And we will be taking data from, we'll be taking structured data from libraries and institutions and converting it to RDF. And in that, and once it's converted into RDF, we'll be doing name and place authority reconciliation, ideally with external authorities, but we'll also, I'm sure, have to create our own internal authority yet again. And we're also creating an authority for manuscripts, right? So every manuscript will have a unique, every manuscript that comes into our data set will have a unique identifier that will stay with that manuscript forever. So I'm not sure how that fits into this group, but I can certainly see, especially with the manuscript identifiers, having to manage change very carefully down the line as manuscripts move around.
So I would wonder if in the scenario you just described, if you would be more on the provider side than the consumer side. You're creating these URIs for these manuscripts and you want to manage the change that happens to those and provide that information out to other folks.
Well, we're sort of on both sides, right? I mean, we certainly want to participate in existing authorities, right? We want to be linking to those existing authorities. And when we're capturing data from institutions, we're capturing it in a variety of formats, mostly MARC, I think is going to be one of our hugest, or, you know, the largest format, the mostly used format. So yeah, I mean, I think part of my interest in being here is trying to figure out, like, where actually do we sit? But we're definitely going to be creating authorities that we hope to make usable to, you know, other sources, other institutions, other resources. So yeah, so where we fit in the ecosystem of authority management and creation, is kind of a question.
Sure. And I do know that authority providers are often either consume their own or consume outside authority data as well. So it's not uncommon to have those roles kind of blend a little bit.
Right.
Since you're talking about data that is created locally, it brings up a question for me on, you know, what makes certain data authoritative. Like we would all be creating descriptions of various kinds of entities in our work. And the entity will have a URI, will have a label. What would make such a descriptive be considered authoritative, and what would be considered local?
Yes, I wonder what.
And I should add that, like, when in our workflows, after we create an entity description, it would go out let's say it would go to Share VDE and would enter their database. It would be entered into their cluster knowledge base. And would that make that description just by being there, some kind of authoritative data when it was created entirely locally for the purpose of describing an entity?
This is actually an important question, because it seems that there's instances of types of material collections locally where you've, say, done a web type exhibit, and you have names, and let's say you have a photography exhibit that's pretty complex and it covers a range of regions and or close pictures of some famous locations in a small area, however it is you're defining the collection. And so let's say you have a local implementation of a name file but that name file would also be sort of faceted as a place file so that somebody would use the place file. So it's authoritative structurally, like in a local sense, but the file may have been a copy of a national or international authoritative file. But because there's going to be some break in that in which you are functionally allowed to create local names which aren't being contributed down or upstream to the so-called official file, there's this issue in which even the local implementation of that, is it still, even though it may have URIs, is it still authoritative because it's actually a slightly unsynced copy by some gap, whatever agreed upon local needs. So I think there's a lot of little issues in there that have to be sort of like, at least, in local workflows, basically worked out. So anyway, that's a very good point, Vitus.
So I wonder if, well, I don't want to cut discussion off yet. I want to see if there are other thoughts that people want to add before we move on. I tried to capture some of those questions in the notes.
Yeah, I guess I would jump in here to say that I feel like any work done outside of upstream environments that might be contributing would require some kind of agreements about what's contributable or that sort of thing. So I hope we circle back to this when we talk about types of changes, because there are going to be I can imagine while wanting to remain relative or have simple signals that something changed or that a label changed, there might be other kinds of changes that an aggregator or a authoritative space might be really interested in surfacing more clearly. So like same asness. So I think Lynn was talking about reconciliation, and if somebody outside of an authority is doing reconciliation work where they're connecting or making connections between different authoritative sources, it might be useful as the caretaker of an authority to know that and maybe bring it in, vet it, and endorse it, or like publish it from the authority's point of view. But you can imagine all the different ways that somebody might want to know how exactly did this thing change, and I think we'd have to be careful not to have a huge taxonomy of types of changes necessarily, but figure out what the most important ones are.
So any other thoughts on use cases? So I think this is great information to keep in our, in mind as we're moving through some of the other questions because we can always come back and look at this and make sure that we're sort of touching base on the things that are salient. But I definitely look to the group to sort of rein things back in or ask more questions as we go along to make sure that we're capturing the things that we need to capture. So I'm gonna jump over to types of change. And I do have a link. There was a couple of us who are in this group who were present at LODLAM 2020. And at that particular conference, we had a meeting on change management. It was a fairly short time period. So, but we did create a document that sort of talked about the different types of changes. And so I put a link to that just for something that folks can browse and we can reference, just to see if we're capturing the same kind of information, use it as sort of a starting point. So I would like to start capturing like types of change that can occur. And I think I'm just gonna start out by just putting in like short words, and then we can come back and sort of expand on what it means and maybe capture some of the nuances. So I'm just going to type in a few, and you guys feel free to shout out if you have others that I'm not typing in there. So those are the ones that we talked about at that LODLAM meeting. So new would be a completely new entity. Deleted would be completely removed. Would there be a distinction between deleted and deprecated, where deprecated it's still around, hasn't been actually removed from the authority?
Hi, Lynette. This is Kevin. I don't know. I can describe what we do at ID. If they delete an LCSH MARC record, we convert it to a deprecated authority at id.loc.gov. We do that because we still need to honor the URI, but we want to indicate that it is no longer meant to be used. Truth be told, we're actually in the process of building in activity streams to id.loc.gov, and because deleted is one of the stock activity stream types, we would probably use that activity stream type in order to indicate that the record had been, that there had been a change, and depending on your perspective, it's either been deleted or deprecated. So I don't have any form of answer other than that just simple description. And we can all decide what is best at that point. But, you know, from the source data's perspective, it has been deleted. The record has been deleted from LCSH. Or if you're dealing with the name authority file, the record has been deleted. It no longer exists. It's out of the file. It's gone. It's history. Bye-bye.
Do you have a separate authority that you move it to once it's deprecated that keeps the URI alive, but it's no longer in the actual authority that it used to live in?
So in the RDF world, all current, active, and usable resources belong to a scheme. So if it's LCSH, it belongs to the subject scheme. If it's a name, it belongs to the names scheme. When we deprecate it, we remove that triple. So it is no longer part of the scheme. It's effectively been removed from the scheme. And when we got offline, I can dig up a couple of URIs that are examples of this. So you can look at the raw data. Everyone can look at the raw data.
And maybe some more context there. Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are times when something is deprecated and deprecated and or and replaced in a different vocabulary, right? Like something that was in LCSH might be deprecated in LCSH and jump over to genre forms.
Correct. And when they do that, they add I don't know what the actual relationship is. I'd have to dig into it, but some kind of reference. They add some kind of piece of information to the quote unquote deleted mark record that says this term or whatever has been replaced with XYZ. And XYZ is the LCCN of the new term, or let's say. In any event, when we encounter that, we do what we can to create a link. In MADS RDF, it's called use instead. So if you hit the deprecated resource, there's a big red box that shows up at the top that says use instead, which will port you to the correct resource in most cases. I don't want to go into the weeds, but I can think of one scenario where we can't do that so nicely. Actually, I won't go into it, but I'll say it. It's when they take a term and they split it into two. So like cookery way back in the day was split into two terms, cookbooks and cooking. So it's one term that got split into two. There are a couple of other examples out there too. We might still be able to create a link in that situation, but it's not clear which one you should be using instead.
Kevin, you would probably think that opportunity or that sort of break in clarity would be a low number use case, like it's something that a person could manually make a decision about. You think would be?
I don't know. So, cookbooks is the one that always comes to my mind because it took a really long, how do I say this? Everyone recognized for quite some time that cookery was completely outdated. Was not just outdated, but not terribly descriptive for the material that it was being used to describe. But it took a long time to replace it because of how many resources use the term cookery. It also shows up in a lot of pre-coordinated headings too. So cookery, hyphen turkey. I'm making that up right now. I don't know what a good subdivision is, but you get the idea. So a term like that can take a long time for us to make the change, but that's immaterial. The bottom line is that type of change, it might just happen once a year, but that's massive. The ripple effect of that is big. And I don't know if this matters, Lynette, but as I see you typing that in, from our perspective, and again, this may not be the case for everything, but from our perspective, I would view split probably as a subclass of deleted almost. The thing that's being split will have been deleted from our vocabularies. Again, I'm not saying that necessarily holds for everything.
I wonder if merged would be similar.
maybe. I honestly can't think of an example of merged. I'd be interested to hear some examples. From my, I was thinking about that a second ago as I was talking, and everything seems to get broken down into smaller and smaller bits. I don't know if I have an example of anything ever being merged.
That happens in mesh. It's usually when they decide to take a common name of something and put it into a scientific name. And so like a bunch of terms kind of all get lumped under like chordata or something like that when they used to be separate. And there's some whole things, but then there's some partial merges and stuff like that that happen as well. So it does happen.
Well, there you go.
And two works can merge into one.
Yeah, that's true too.
And this, I mean, merging happens pretty frequently with identity metadata, especially like I've seen this happen in Wikidata quite a lot, just because you often have big batch imports that create redundant entities for the same person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I guess that that even happens in NACO work if you find duplicates and stuff. And
yeah, I think that's pretty frequent. I mean, like it's pretty frequent in ISNI, is my understanding, as somebody who doesn't actually edit ISNIs directly. But it just seems like this is less I think for our purposes, it doesn't really matter why it happens, but it does seem like on the splitting operations that we're talking about are about a deliberate decision to like, separate things out for to meet user needs, whereas like merging is, I feel like that's often the result of just errors or just like known inefficiencies in a system. It's not about somebody saying, I thought these were two different things, but I didn't realize, or we decided these things that we used to consider distinct are now not distinct.
yeah, it can also happen with scientific data because they find like things change classes or change families or whatever, and they decide to classify something taxonomically. And so, and that can happen in true taxonomy, but it can also happen in vocabulary taxonomies as well.
So I have a question, Kevin. You said something about activity stream. Is that a feed that you're currently doing when changes happen?
No, it's something that we're developing and working up right now.
So it's
not
under development. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's in development, under development.
And its ultimate intention is to be sort of a change management stream?
Yeah, we're taking it slowly to see what we can do. So right now we use an Atom feed to indicate changes. You can query you can't query. You can poll the Atom feed and page backwards in time. It's everything that the output of the Atom feed is ordered in descending order of date last modified. And it will basically tell you if a resource has been updated or if it has been deleted. With activity streams, so anyway, the Atom feed went into place, I don't know, in 2009, 2010. It went into place at a time when there was no standard way to communicate this information. So with the advent of activity streams, and it being JSON LD, which is to say RDF, linked data, we figured we would look at integrating activity streams into id.loc.gov in order to communicate the same information that we've been communicating all this time through the Atom feed, but also seeing what else we can do, or what else we can communicate that may be of benefit to ourselves and others. So, I apologize to everybody. I got into this about 12 minutes late. I just plumb forgot. But going back, I saw that the label changes, for example, was listed as a use case. We have that use case too. We don't know. we don't know when a label changes on a resource. So we know that, if we get an updated LCSH record, or we get an updated name authority record in MARC, it has a last modified data, say yesterday, but we have absolutely no idea what changed about it. So we're looking at whether or not we can track, whether we in ied.loc.gov can track whether or not the preferred label or the authoritative label changed. And and we're confident we can, we just got to figure out how to do it. And once we do, we want to issue that as a specific activity stream, so that if you as a consumer, and we are also consumers of our own stuff, only want to know which resources in id.loc.gov had their labels changed in, let's say, the last week, all you have to do is fetch that. You could hit that activity stream. So that's the long-term objective. Briefly.
No, I wonder if that implies that we should have, so we have changed, which is like anything changed. But I wonder if we should have label changed as well, as like a separate line to itself.
I would. I mean, or I don't know if that would be the actual type. I can't remember if we've even gotten as far as trying to figure out how would we communicate that specific difference. I guess I'd have to look at activity streams and see what it permits. But the short is, yes, we would want to be able to communicate. Well, I guess it depends on how you do it. Yes, I mean, that's definitely a use case to communicate, to have a type or something like that that communicates the type of change. The way ID is built, we could communicate it through the URL pattern. But having an actual type that makes it a bit more explicit in the data itself, yeah, that could be a good thing.
I remember when I went to WikiCite like a couple years ago, there was a developer who gave a sort of speculative talk about change management in Wikidata, where he sort of posited the idea that, there are changes that you expect to happen frequently or to be additive, and that and then there are other things that I think the phrase he used was low velocity changes, like label changes, where that change should sort of be treated as a different kind of event, because it's often because it makes such a difference for the user experience. Like a label changes a perception of a thing, and like a person's name doesn't change that often, right? So you don't expect that to be something that changes on an annual basis. I'm thinking here of Wikidata specifically because some of us work in these systems that we control a lot, and name changes might just always be an improvement. And then I'm also thinking about things like Wikidata, which might be really susceptible to vandalism. Most of the vandalism I've seen in Wikidata has strictly been about label changes. And so I think thinking about label changes or other things that you don't expect to change often is as a separate thing might be useful. Sorry, that was long-winded to say, yes, I think you're right.
Well, I think what is considered an important change would depends on how a particular library make use of the data. So if we, let's say we display cross-references from authority records, and a cross-reference is added to a nav record, that could be important to us. But if you are using the authoritative label and URI in Sinopia, and that's all you have used, then the addition of a cross-reference may be of no interest to you, and it doesn't need to be managed, and you don't want to receive an update record when that event occurs.
All right, so I think I'm going to go ahead and close off conversation for today because we are at time. One of the things I'm thinking about for next time, just based on the conversation we had, is that we might want to go through and do examples of each of these, and we can consider some of these things that were brought up around a high impact, importance of the data that changed, velocity of change, those kind of things, and like how did we can start exploring how did those play into some of the things around change management as well. And I would say that if anyone has links to references we might want to look at, like if LOC has documentation on their activity stream, if there are others who have documentation on how they're doing change management, I would love to include those references in our documents as well. So you can either send them to me, or you can edit these documents yourself. I will say, I'm not sure everybody has access to editing the wiki or to the Slack channel that we have set up. So if you need information on either of those, you can ping me and I will see about getting you set up to be able to access those. And I just want to thank everyone for being here today. I think we're off to a great start, and we will meet again in 2 weeks.